Good evening. Tonight, we begin with urgent breaking developments that represent the most dangerous escalation in this war since its beginning nearly 3 years ago. Picture this. American intelligence agencies have detected unmistakable preparations by Russia to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to forward positions near the Ukrainian border, movements so concerning that the White House issued an extraordinary public warning directly to the Kremlin that any use of such weapons would trigger immediate and overwhelming response. Within hours of Washington's warning, Ukraine launched massive coordinated strikes against Russian military facilities deep inside Russian territory, destroying command centers, ammunition depots, and targeting the very facilities where tactical nuclear weapons were reportedly being prepared for deployment. This is happening right now. What we are witnessing is not diplomatic posturing or routine military operations. It is the most dangerous moment in this conflict. The point where nuclear escalation becomes not theoretical but imminent, where warnings must be issued publicly because private channels have failed, and where Ukraine concludes that waiting for Russia to complete nuclear preparations would be suicidal. When the United States issues public warnings about nuclear weapons, when Ukraine launches deep strikes into Russia despite escalation risks, these are indicators that we have entered fundamentally new and terrifying territory. Think about that. For months, Russia has threatened nuclear weapons use, waved the nuclear card to deter Western support, and used nuclear rhetoric as psychological weapon. But tonight's developments are different. American intelligence agencies detected actual physical movement of tactical nuclear weapons from secure storage facilities to forward deployment areas. They observed Russian military units conducting training exercises specifically for tactical nuclear employment. They intercepted communications discussing nuclear strike options. These are not threats designed to intimidate. These are preparations for potential use. This is where deterrence confronts the possibility of failure. History provides sobering and terrifying context for understanding what happens when nuclear powers approach the brink and what actions can pull them back from catastrophe. These moments are extraordinarily rare but instructive because they reveal how close humanity has come to nuclear war and what interventions prevented escalation. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 remains the closest the world has come to nuclear war. 13 terrifying days when American and Soviet leaders stared directly into the abyss of nuclear destruction and nearly fell into it, bringing humanity to within hours of potential extinction. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev secretly deployed medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles to Cuba, weapons capable of striking American cities including Washington, New York, and other major population centers with virtually no warning time, fundamentally altering the strategic balance. President John F. Kennedy, upon discovering the missiles through U-2 reconnaissance photographs that showed construction of launch sites, demanded their immediate removal and imposed a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent additional Soviet weapons from reaching the island. For nearly 2 weeks, that felt like an eternity. The world held its collective breath as the two nuclear superpowers maneuvered toward direct confrontation. Soviet submarines carrying nuclear-tipped torpedoes approached the American blockade line, with submarine commanders authorized to use nuclear weapons if they believed they were under attack. American forces prepared invasion plans for Cuba and conducted military exercises that Soviet intelligence interpreted as preparation for actual invasion. Strategic nuclear bombers were placed on continuous airborne alert, flying patterns that kept them ready to strike Soviet targets within minutes of receiving launch orders. At multiple documented points during the crisis, individual decisions by submarine commanders who lost communication with Moscow, intelligence officers who misinterpreted radar signals, or military leaders who advocated preemptive strikes could have triggered nuclear exchange that would have killed hundreds of millions. What prevented absolute catastrophe was a complex combination of private diplomatic communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev conducted through informal back channels, public signaling that conveyed unwavering resolve without issuing ultimatums that would leave no room for retreat, And crucially, Kennedy's politically risky decision to offer Khrushchev a face-saving compromise by secretly agreeing to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet withdrawal of missiles from Cuba. The crisis ended not through one side's capitulation, but through carefully negotiated settlement that allowed both sides to claim publicly that they achieved their core objectives while making private concessions that enabled peaceful resolution. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War, known as the Yom Kippur War, after the Jewish holy day when Egypt and Syria launched their surprise attack, brought the United States and Soviet Union perilously close to the brink of nuclear confrontation in a regional conflict where neither superpower was directly engaged militarily, but where both had vital interests at stake. When Israeli forces, after suffering devastating initial setbacks and territorial losses, reversed the battlefield situation and encircled the entire Egyptian Third Army in the Sinai Peninsula, threatening its complete destruction and potential humiliation for Soviet ally Egypt, Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev sent an urgent and alarming message to President Richard Nixon, suggesting joint American-Soviet military intervention to save the surrounded Egyptian forces and prevent what Moscow viewed as unacceptable Israeli victory. When the United States firmly rejected the proposal for joint intervention, viewing it as unacceptable Soviet interference in a regional conflict where America backed Israel, Brezhnev threatened unilateral Soviet intervention, stating that the Soviet Union would act alone if necessary to prevent Egyptian military collapse. Nixon, despite being consumed by the Watergate scandal that would eventually force his resignation, responded decisively by placing American nuclear forces worldwide on DEFCON 3 alert status, a heightened readiness level that signals preparation for potential nuclear war and involves recall of military personnel, increased bomber readiness, and enhanced surveillance of Soviet military activities. Soviet military intelligence observed the dramatic alert status change through multiple intelligence channels and recognized that American leadership, even amid domestic political crisis, was genuinely willing to risk nuclear confrontation to prevent unilateral Soviet military intervention in the Middle East. The crisis de-escalated rapidly when both superpowers, recognizing how close they had come to direct confrontation, exerted intense pressure on their regional allies to accept an immediate ceasefire, demonstrating that nuclear powers can signal resolve through military readiness and alert status without actually initiating combat operations, and that mutual recognition of escalation risks can create incentives for restraint. These historical examples share common elements that illuminate the current crisis. First, nuclear escalation risks emerge when one power takes actions the other considers intolerable to its vital interests. Second, public warnings serve to communicate, resolve, and create costs for escalation. Third, military readiness and demonstrated capability to respond can deter without requiring actual use of force. Fourth, off-ramps and face-saving compromises are essential to preventing escalation spirals, where neither side can back down without humiliation. Here's what makes the current situation so extraordinarily dangerous and unprecedented. Russia's movement of tactical nuclear weapons to forward positions represents crossing a threshold that has been carefully respected by nuclear powers for decades through informal but powerful norms. During the Cold War, despite tens of thousands of nuclear weapons deployed by both superpowers at hundreds of locations around the world, tactical nuclear weapons were never moved to forward positions during crises or periods of heightened tension because doing so would signal imminent intent to use them and would be interpreted by the adversary as preparation for first strike. Russia's current actions deliberately break this long-standing norm and suggest either that Putin genuinely intends to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine or that he believes threatening their imminent use through visible, forward deployment will force Ukraine to surrender and force Western governments to abandon military support out of fear of nuclear escalation. The ambiguity about Putin's actual intentions is itself destabilizing because it forces the West and Ukraine to prepare for the worst-case scenario while hoping that deterrence can still work. American intelligence assessments, based on comprehensive collection from satellite imagery that provides visual confirmation of weapon movements, signals intelligence that intercepts Russian military communications, and highly classified human sources with access to Russian decision-making indicate conclusively that Russia has moved several tactical nuclear warheads from secure central storage facilities in Russia's interior to military bases much closer to Ukraine. These are not massive strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles designed to strike the United States across thousands of miles, but smaller battlefield weapons specifically designed for use against military targets on a more limited geographic scale. Their yield ranges from less than 1 kiloton, smaller than the Hiroshima bomb, to perhaps 50 kilotons, larger than Hiroshima, but still smaller than strategic weapons, and they can be delivered by aircraft, short-range missiles, or artillery, depending on the specific weapon design. The movement of these weapons represents a dramatic escalation because it reduces the time needed to employ them from days to potentially hours. The intelligence further indicates that Russian military units have conducted highly sensitive training exercises, practicing specific procedures for tactical nuclear weapons employment, including detailed drills on how to safely transport them from secure storage to forward launch sites, how to technically mate nuclear warheads to delivery systems such as missiles or bombs, and how to execute complex launch protocols that require multiple levels of authorization. These exercises are extraordinarily sensitive from an operational security perspective and would only be conducted if political and military leadership was seriously considering actual use, not merely posturing for deterrence effect. The fact that these exercises were detected by Western intelligence suggests either that Russia conducted them with unusual openness or that Western intelligence capabilities for monitoring Russian nuclear activities are more comprehensive than Russia realized. American officials briefed on the intelligence described the situation as the most dangerous nuclear crisis since the Cold War ended. One senior Pentagon official, speaking on condition of anonymity, stated that the United States has high confidence that Russia has moved tactical nuclear weapons forward and moderate confidence that Putin has not yet made a final decision on whether to use them. That assessment suggests a window for deterrence to work, but a closing window. Think about that. Russia has moved nuclear weapons into position for potential use. American intelligence believes Putin has not yet decided whether to use them, and the United States must now try to deter use without triggering the very escalation it seeks to prevent. Here's the first hook. Washington's public warning represents a calculated gamble that exposing Russian preparations will shame or deter Putin from following through. By making intelligence public, the United States removes Putin's ability to use nuclear weapons with element of surprise, alerts Ukraine to prepare defenses and response options, and signals to the world that if nuclear weapons are used, responsibility lies entirely with Russia. But public warnings also carry risk. They can back Putin into a corner where he feels he must follow through to maintain credibility, or they can be ignored if Putin concludes the West is bluffing about consequences. The White House warning was delivered through multiple carefully coordinated channels simultaneously to ensure that Putin received the message absolutely unambiguously and that he could not later claim ignorance or misunderstanding. President Biden spoke directly in a televised address from the White House Oval Office during prime time, stating gravely that any use of nuclear weapons by Russia would be met with catastrophic consequences for the Russian state, and that the United States will not allow nuclear blackmail to succeed in the 21st century. The statement was deliberately and strategically vague about what precisely catastrophic consequences would entail, leaving Putin to imagine the worst possibilities while preserving American flexibility about specific response options and avoiding commitments that might later prove impossible to fulfill. The ambiguity is intentional. It maximizes deterrence by suggesting unlimited retaliation while avoiding the constraints of public ultimatums. Simultaneously with the president's address, the U.S. ambassador to Russia delivered a formal diplomatic note to the Russian Foreign Ministry, specifying in precise terms American concerns about specific Russian military activities and reiterating warnings about consequences. American military commanders contacted their Russian military counterparts through the limited military-to-military communication channels that remain open despite the war to reinforce the message at the operational level. And American intelligence agencies used covert back channels to communicate directly to Russian security services that senior Russian officials, including potentially Putin himself, would be held personally accountable through war crimes, prosecutions, and other mechanisms for any nuclear use. The multifaceted delivery system ensures that Putin cannot plausibly claim he did not receive the warning, cannot dismiss it as mere rhetoric without substance, and cannot deflect responsibility by blaming subordinates for failing to inform him of American concerns. Every possible pathway for communication was deliberately used to eliminate any ambiguity. The multifaceted delivery system ensures that Putin cannot claim he did not receive the warning, cannot dismiss it as rhetoric, and cannot blame subordinates for failing to inform him. Every possible pathway for communication was used. NATO allies were briefed in advance through secure channels and issued carefully coordinated statements supporting the American position and warning Russia of severe consequences. Britain, France, and Germany, the three European nuclear and major powers with the most significant military capabilities and political influence, issued a rare joint statement declaring that any Russian nuclear use would fundamentally alter the character of this conflict in ways that would require responses of historic magnitude and would be met with a response unprecedented in its scope and severity. China was also briefed by senior American officials in a private meeting in Beijing and reportedly conveyed its own stern message to Moscow through diplomatic channels that nuclear use would damage the Russia-China strategic partnership irreparably and would isolate Russia completely in Asia. The diplomatic coordination demonstrates comprehensively that the United States is not acting alone in issuing warnings, but has built broad international consensus that nuclear use is absolutely unacceptable and will be met with unified and overwhelming response. The diplomatic coordination demonstrates that the United States is not acting alone, but has built international consensus that nuclear use is unacceptable and will be met with unified response. This coordination is essential because Putin must understand that nuclear use would isolate Russia completely, not just from the West, but from its remaining partners. Ukraine's response to both Russian nuclear preparations and Washington's warning has been swift, forceful, and strategically calculated. Rather than waiting defensively for Russia to complete nuclear preparations, Ukraine launched massive coordinated strikes against Russian military facilities deep inside Russian territory, using long-range missiles, drones, and potentially special operations forces. Ukrainian strikes targeted multiple categories of Russian military facilities deep inside Russian territory using sophisticated long-range missiles, large numbers of drones operating in coordinated swarms, and potentially special operations forces conducting sabotage missions. Specific targets included Russian command centers directly responsible for nuclear weapons operations and command and control, massive ammunition depots storing conventional weapons that might be used in combination with nuclear weapons in escalation scenarios, and critical airfields where tactical nuclear weapons could theoretically be loaded onto aircraft for delivery to Ukrainian targets. Ukrainian military officials confirmed the strikes publicly through official statements, but deliberately declined to specify which specific weapons systems were used, whether Western-provided long-range missiles such as ATACMS or Storm Shadow were employed, or what levels of damage were achieved. The ambiguity serves Ukrainian interests by keeping Russia uncertain about Ukrainian capabilities, while avoiding Western political complications about whether restrictions on Western weapons use were violated. The strikes represent Ukrainian strategic calculation that allowing Russia to complete nuclear preparations without any disruption or military response would be significantly more dangerous than the escalation risks inherent in striking deep into Russian territory. Ukrainian political and military leadership concluded after careful analysis that Russia must pay immediate and substantial costs for nuclear threats and preparations, that Russian nuclear infrastructure must be physically disrupted before weapons can actually be employed, and that demonstrating Ukrainian capability to strike anywhere inside Russia would fundamentally complicate Russian military planning and potentially deter follow-on nuclear preparations. The calculus reflects Ukrainian understanding that passivity in the face of nuclear threats invites escalation, while active defense and disruption might actually prevent nuclear use by raising the costs and complicating the operational requirements. Western officials, speaking privately to journalists on condition of anonymity, expressed genuine concern about Ukrainian strikes, fearing seriously that they could provoke the very Russian nuclear escalation that everyone desperately seeks to prevent. But they also acknowledged the brutal logic of Ukrainian reasoning, waiting passively for Russia to complete nuclear preparations and potentially use nuclear weapons would guarantee catastrophe and provide no opportunity for disruption, while active and immediate disruption of Russian preparations through military strikes might prevent use entirely or at minimum complicate Russian operational planning sufficiently to buy time for diplomacy. The dilemma reflects a fundamental tension inherent in deterrence between showing strength and resolve versus avoiding provocative actions, between demonstrating capability to respond and avoiding escalation spirals that no one can control. There are no perfect options when facing a nuclear-armed adversary that appears willing to consider nuclear use. Only choices between different risks and different potential catastrophes. Russian response to Ukrainian strikes has been characterized by furious rhetoric and angry denunciations, but surprisingly limited actual military action beyond the rhetoric, suggesting that Ukraine's strikes may have achieved their primary purpose of disrupting Russian preparations without triggering the immediate dramatic escalation that many feared. Russian officials condemned the strikes publicly as acts of terrorism against civilian infrastructure and threatened undefined retaliation, but notably and significantly did not threaten immediate nuclear response or suggest that nuclear weapons would be used imminently. Russian military commanders appear to be conducting damage assessments of struck facilities and carefully reconsidering nuclear deployment plans in light of Ukrainian demonstrated capability and willingness to strike deep into Russian destruction senses territory. The measured Russian military response, despite angry political rhetoric, suggests either that damage to Russian facilities was substantial enough to require reconsideration of plans, or that Russian nuclear preparations were more tentative than Western intelligence initially assessed. The limited Russian response may indicate that Putin recognizes that following through with nuclear use after Ukrainian disrupted preparations would appear as reaction to defeat rather than calculated escalation. Or it may indicate that Russian nuclear preparations were more tentative than intelligence suggested, and that Ukrainian strikes provided Putin an excuse to back away from option he was not fully committed to pursuing. The strategic implications of this crisis extend far beyond immediate military calculations and touch on fundamental questions about nuclear deterrence in the 21st century. For decades, nuclear deterrence rested on the assumption that nuclear weapons would never be used because the consequences would be catastrophic for all parties. That assumption is now being tested in real time with a nuclear power that is losing a conventional war and may conclude that nuclear use is preferable to defeat. American and NATO military planners have spent many months developing detailed response options and operational plans should Russia actually use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. These carefully developed options range from massive conventional military strikes against Russian forces operating inside Ukraine to much broader strikes against Russian military infrastructure throughout Western Russia to, in the absolute worst-case scenario, limited nuclear retaliation designed to demonstrate that nuclear use cannot succeed. The goal of developing and maintaining multiple response options across this spectrum is to ensure that any Russian nuclear use, regardless of scale or target, can be met with calibrated response that punishes Russia severely without necessarily triggering uncontrolled, all-out nuclear war that would destroy civilization. But the extraordinary complexity of response planning and the intense debates within NATO about which responses would be appropriate reveal the fundamental problem that haunts nuclear deterrence. Once nuclear weapons are actually used, even tactically against military targets, the psychological and political barriers to further escalation become dramatically weaker. But the complexity of response planning reveals the fundamental problem. Once nuclear weapons are used anywhere, even tactically, against purely military targets with minimal civilian casualties, the psychological barriers and political constraints to further escalation become much weaker for all parties involved. Each side will feel enormous domestic and international pressure to respond with even greater force to demonstrate credibly that it cannot be intimidated by nuclear threats or nuclear use. Escalation spirals are disturbingly easy to imagine theoretically and extraordinarily difficult to control once they begin in practice because neither side can afford to be seen as weak or intimidated by the adversary. Think about that carefully. If Russia uses even a single small tactical nuclear weapon against a military target in Ukraine, the pressure on the United States and NATO to respond with overwhelming force will be enormous. Failure to respond would suggest that nuclear use can succeed, inviting further use. But responding with strikes on Russian territory risks triggering Russian escalation against NATO itself, potentially leading to nuclear exchange that destroys civilization. Here's the second hook. Ukraine's willingness to strike deep into Russia demonstrates that Ukraine will not be deterred by nuclear threats and will take extraordinary risks to prevent nuclear use. This willingness complicates Russian calculations because it means that nuclear threats alone are insufficient to force Ukrainian surrender, and that actual use might not achieve intended political objectives because Ukraine would continue fighting regardless. The public nature of this crisis marks a significant departure from historical practice, where nuclear crises were managed quietly through diplomatic channels. The Cuban Missile Crisis, despite its public dimension, involved extensive secret communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev that were essential to peaceful resolution. The current crisis involves public warnings, public strikes, and public rhetoric that leave less room for quiet diplomacy and face-saving compromises. Western officials are attempting to create viable diplomatic off-ramps and face-saving exit strategies, even as military tensions escalate to dangerous levels. American officials have signaled, through multiple intermediaries and back channels, that if Russia withdraws tactical nuclear weapons from forward positions and publicly commits to non-use, the United States would be willing to engage immediately in broader negotiations about ending the war on terms that address legitimate Russian security concerns. European leaders have proposed ambitious international conferences to discuss comprehensive Ukrainian security guarantees that might address Russian stated concerns about NATO expansion while preserving Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. But these well-intentioned diplomatic initiatives face profound and potentially insurmountable obstacles. Putin has staked his political legitimacy and personal authority on achieving military victory in Ukraine and may genuinely believe that accepting any negotiated settlement would be tantamount to admitting defeat and would threaten his grip on power. But these diplomatic initiatives face profound obstacles. Putin has staked his legitimacy on achieving military victory in Ukraine and may believe that accepting negotiated settlement would be tantamount to admitting defeat. Ukrainian leadership remains unwilling to cede territory or accept limitations on sovereignty in exchange for temporary peace. And Western governments are deeply divided about how much pressure to place on Ukraine to negotiate versus how much military support to provide for continued resistance. These divisions weaken Western diplomatic unity and make comprehensive settlements extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Something deeper than immediate military crisis is at stake in these developments. We are witnessing a test of whether nuclear deterrence can function in an era of regional conflicts, whether nuclear powers can be prevented from using nuclear weapons when they face conventional defeat, and whether the international community can enforce norms against nuclear use without triggering the very catastrophe they seek to prevent. The crisis reveals fundamental instability in the post-Cold War international order and the fragility of nuclear deterrence in regional conflicts. During the Cold War, nuclear deterrence was relatively stable because both superpowers clearly understood that nuclear war would be mutually suicidal. But in conflicts where nuclear powers fight non-nuclear states, the deterrence equation is fundamentally different and more dangerous. The nuclear power may calculate incorrectly that limited nuclear use against a non-nuclear adversary will not trigger nuclear retaliation and therefore becomes thinkable in ways that nuclear war between superpowers never was. What prevents Russia from using nuclear weapons in this scenario is not Ukrainian nuclear capability, which does not exist, but the credible threat of American and NATO response. That extended deterrence depends entirely on American credibility, on Russian belief that the United States would actually follow through with promised catastrophic consequences. If Putin concludes that American warnings are empty, that the West would not risk nuclear escalation over Ukraine, then deterrence fails catastrophically, and nuclear use becomes likely. Maintaining credibility without actually having to demonstrate willingness through nuclear use is the central challenge of extended deterrence. The lesson is universal and applies to every potential future nuclear crisis. Nuclear deterrence requires not just capability, but credible willingness to use that capability. Adversaries must believe that the cost of nuclear use will exceed any possible benefit. And yet, demonstrating credibility without actually using nuclear weapons is extraordinarily difficult because it requires convincing rational adversaries to believe you would do something that appears fundamentally irrational, namely, risking nuclear war over interests that may not seem vital enough to justify such catastrophic risks. Washington issued its urgent warning. Ukraine responded with force. Russia now faces a choice about whether to proceed with nuclear escalation despite international warnings and Ukrainian disruption of preparations. That choice will be made by Vladimir Putin personally, based on his personal assessment of Russian interests, his judgment about Western resolve and determination, and his calculation about whether nuclear use advances his objectives or ensures his defeat. The world watches and waits. Intelligence agencies continue monitoring Russian military movements with heightened vigilance. Diplomatic channels remain open for Putin to choose de-escalation. Military forces on all sides remain at heightened readiness for any contingency. And everyone hopes desperately that deterrence works, that rationality prevails over emotion, that humanity steps back from the nuclear brink one more time before it is too late. You can threaten nuclear weapons use to intimidate adversaries and force concessions, but you cannot undo the catastrophic consequences once weapons are actually used. You can move nuclear weapons into forward positions to demonstrate resolve and commitment, but you cannot prevent adversaries from disrupting your preparations if they conclude that stopping you is worth the escalation risk and potential consequences. And you can test whether the international community will actually enforce norms against nuclear use. But you cannot accurately predict whether that test will prevent catastrophe or actually trigger it. Washington warned urgently after detecting Russia's latest and most dangerous move toward potential tactical nuclear weapons use. Ukraine responded with forceful strikes designed to disrupt Russian nuclear preparations before they could be completed. Russia now must decide whether to escalate further, despite international warnings and Ukrainian disruption, or to step back from the nuclear brink. The world faces the most dangerous nuclear crisis in decades, and the outcome will determine whether nuclear deterrence still functions effectively in the 21st century or whether humanity must learn again through terrible experience why nuclear weapons must never be used. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed and good night.